Welcome to S&C's podcast series, S&C Critical Insights. I'm Nader Mousavi, a partner and co-head of Sullivan & Cromwell's IP and Technology Group and our artificial intelligence practice. I'm based in our Palo Alto office. With me is Jay Clayton, former chair of the SEC and a senior policy advisor and of counsel to Sullivan & Cromwell, and based in our New York office.
Thank you, Nader. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that is increasingly relevant for boards of directors, business leaders, governance experts, and it's a topic that has already evolved. And really the question around effective AI governance, key considerations for the boards in developing AI oversight comes down to what are our objectives for AI? And we should all recognize that while we look at this from the sort of top down, anytime we look at governance, those objectives are going to vary and the considerations are going to vary significantly from industry to industry and company to company. Nader, let me ask you a question, which is, why is AI governance important?
Jay, that is a very good question. So when we think about AI governance, and to your point that the nature of governance is going to need to depend very much on the AI being used and the relevant industry and use case, there are a wide range of potential applications. AI is really just a fundamental technology, although in the last couple of years, we've seen this huge tidal wave of interest in generative AI. AI has been around in one form or another for decades and is already being used in many daily applications, ranging from right on our smartphones to our mapping applications and voice assistants and the like. So there is a question that one can start with, which is what makes this time different than what we've already been managing with many companies in technology for many years. And I think part of that answer is that generative AI, which has been enabled by a series of new developments in the model architecture, as well as an increase in the power and availability of compute through the GPU and a vast availability of data to train these models, has really created some breakthroughs in the ability of models to process information and make predictions and be deployed in a wide range of new applications that many companies are just beginning to grapple with. One other point that I want to say for this podcast that we're focusing on is AI governance, and a lot of the controversies around AI governance that are very public are focused on how AI companies, those are engaged in the development of large language models or other very powerful models, how they should be governed. And what we're really focusing on here is the governance of AI in the context of an organization that is deploying AI, that they might be fine-tuning, they might be developing further, but the fundamental developments around the models have occurred through an AI provider of some sort.
Yeah, that's a great point. You make 2 points there, Nader, that I'm going to tie together. One is that this has been around for a while, but we've had a step change, I would say, in functionality and a step change in potential applications that have drawn a great deal of attention. And they're non-AI companies, but in companies, large companies, smaller companies across industries, grappling with how they deal with this. Oftentimes, when you have a step change, when you have something new, a board of directors or a governance architecture is put together that deals with it as a separate function. And I go back to some of the discussions that you and I have had over the years on cybersecurity at the board level, I would say as an agenda item, and was often, and I think incorrectly, treated as separate from the rest of the company. Cybersecurity governance has evolved in what I'd say is a very good direction over the last decade, where it's now part of an integrated governance model. Of course, you have cyber experts. Of course, you ask the question, But when you think about the risks and you think about from a board of directors, your cybersecurity profile, you actually think across the organization. I am hoping that the same thing occurs with AI governance in that it's not looked at as an isolated agenda item for a board of directors, for a risk committee, but rather looked at it as how is it affecting the organization as a whole and incorporated into existing control and oversight frameworks. So that's a bit of perspective, but let's just remember that very few of these types of issues can be dealt with in isolation.
Jay, I completely agree with that. I would add that we are in a time now when boards think about how to govern AI. There's a rapid development and evolution of this marketplace on many levels. The technology itself is developing at a breakneck pace. There are new capabilities, new types of models, new use cases that are being discovered or implemented on a weekly, monthly basis. The regulatory environment itself is emerging and dynamic. There's an executive order in the United States that lays out a framework for how different government agencies should engage and think about regulating AI. There's no comprehensive federal omnibus legislation that addresses AI. And in that vacuum, if you will, there are hundreds of state bills working their way through various legislatures, all addressing different aspects of what potential perceived risks are with the adoption of AI. So you have an environment where there is technology development, there's regulatory evolution, and then there's actual business use case evolution. And in that environment, boards that are thinking about how to properly govern AI, I believe need to start with some fundamental business questions and technology questions of what are the opportunities created by AI and the advancements of AI, particularly generative AI, for one's business? Is it merely going to be a desktop productivity tool? Is it going to be a means for making software development more efficient with AI generated code, which many corporates are adopting and developers tend to really like? Is it going to improve customer service experiences? Is it going to help sales teams figure out how better to propose products that work for a particular customer application, where I've heard some use cases of some very significant returns in short periods with generative AI to help work through complex sales inventories, or other applications that you can imagine where AI is built in to a company's own products and services and leveraged to improve them and actually generate new revenue, like you've seen Microsoft do in building in AI into its desktop productivity suite and offering that with an upcharge. So direct value for offering AI capabilities. There's really a wide range. And for a company to think about, practically speaking, what are the ways in which they can capitalize on the new technologies, understanding how their competitors may be doing that, so how it's going to affect the competitive landscape around them, and then thinking about a strategy for what the adoption curve should look like in their organization to ensure that they're maintaining at least a competitive position with the market, if not capitalizing and creating some competitive advantages. And then once you have that framework, evaluating what are the risks of adoption, what could go wrong. There are a lot of considerations around that, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. And then ultimately, now we plug in what is the governance framework and controls for the adoption of the AI that is best for the business. And if you're talking about merely a strategy that says the only real significant application of AI in our business is going to be desktop productivity, that is a very limited scope of things that can go wrong, if you will. It's certainly not zero. There's probably employee policies and training and protocols and human in the loop and those types of things that are always going to be important. It's a very different picture than if you're building a new product line whose fundamental operation will depend on a large language model from a third party, whether that's open source or proprietary. And now you're thinking about how anything that might go wrong and how that model operates could impact your customers or your reputation in the marketplace. Very different set of considerations from a governance perspective and what type of protocols would need to be followed to ensure that the organization is operating in a way that's consistent with its risk-based approach.
Well, Nader, I think you did a wonderful job in laying out the spectrum of possible considerations from what I would say is an ordinary development in the life cycle of a company to something that may fundamentally change the company and the industry. And from a broader perspective, talking to directors in this area, my advice is going to go back to basics, which is what's the role of a board of directors in any circumstance like this? It's twofold. It's oversight, making sure that the right questions are being asked and the right structures are in place to get information and consideration and dialogue going within the organization, being mindful of regulation and the like. But it's also empowerment. And oftentimes, when we talk about governance and we talk about oversight, we focus only on oversight. But oversight also includes, or governance also includes, empowerment. And how do you put management in a place where they can put the company's best foot forward with respect to AI? I think that that's a very important thing to incorporate in any governance approach to AI. What do you think?
I totally agree, Jay. And it brings up a number of issues, which is one key question a board should ask itself in embarking down this path is, does it have already the necessary expertise at the board to be able to ensure that they're asking the right questions and developing a strategy? And if it does need some additional resources, presentations, education, to make sure that those are part of the agenda, and that be a key step in making sure that they evaluate the range of potential implications. Certainly, there is, at the management level, the empowerment point is key. And ultimately, while the board may be engaging in oversight, operationally, the management will be evaluating the use cases, bringing in and needing essentially a structure to evaluate the new use cases of AI and the potential implications of those. And this brings up a point that I believe a lot of organizations adopting AI have considered. And from my perspective, I have not yet seen a consensus on how to handle this because there is an emerging set of practices here. But a question that we get a lot is, does the organization need to have a separate governance structure in order to govern AI? Or can it rely on its existing structures, whether those be data rights management, product management, cyber, compliance, legal? And there are some sources out there, including a leading governance source in the AI discussion, which is NIST, that has developed a risk management framework. And the NIST framework does suggest that there are unique risks in AI, particularly generative AI, that require distinct governance. And there are ways in which I can certainly agree with that premise. And in order to evaluate, for example, the deployment of generative AI in a customer-facing application, you'd need to get comfortable with a wide range of potential considerations. And the conversation to evaluate those would include product, technology, compliance, legal, cyber, and the list goes on. So whether or not an organization has in place a mechanism where all of those relevant stakeholders can weigh in efficiently on the potential new use cases, it may require creating ad hoc committees and the like. But ultimately, it is critical that in the chain of management and oversight of new AI use cases, that there is someone that's designated as being responsible for the determinations of risk benefit and where those could have a significant impact, that those are fleshed up to be considered as well at the board level.
Now, that makes a lot of sense. Although I will tell you that my bias over the years around new developments like this is yes, to have it treated at an ad hoc level with specific focus, but that if it's always going to be segregated from other governance and reporting structures, that comes with its own risks. And I think the most effective organizations in terms of managing risks and managing oversight, and then also managing empowerment, which is so important because if you're not getting the benefits, well, then why are we spending all of this time? But managing empowerment, they do it as part of an integrated whole. For example, if AI is a big part of your governance structure, the big part of your oversight structure, it sure better be a big part of your strategy. And I think sometimes when we focus on governance, we forget that. I want to turn to another area, and that is regulation and how regulation fits with AI. And I have an observation that I'd like to get your perspective on, feedback, perhaps critique. And that is when a company looks at AI and regulation, I think there was some initial thought that AI would allow regulatory functions to operate with fewer people, that there would be a reduction in human capital and that systems might be streamlined and the like. I do not expect that initially, or at least in the next 5 or so years in heavily regulated industries. And let me explain why. Most regulation focuses on nodes in the network of a company or a system, and those nodes are usually people. Regulators implement their regulations by putting responsibilities both on companies as a whole, but also on people. And to the extent folks are thinking about AI as replacing people, you have to remember that that regulatory architecture is in tension with that desire to reduce headcount. Said another more pragmatic way, I think the way to use AI in a heavily regulated area is actually to enhance the existing human function in the first instance, demonstrating better compliance, more forward-looking compliance, rather than thinking about replacing existing human-based systems. And so I don't think, at least in the near term, you're going to have a substantial headcount reduction or a substantial change in architecture as a result of AI being brought to regulatory and control functions.
That makes a lot of sense to me, Jay. And I'd add a few thoughts on that, which is what is the architecture for how the United States is approaching the regulation of AI today? And how does that differ from what is happening in Europe and some other places? And the current trend in US regulation of AI is to allow a sectoral approach with different various industry regulatory agencies defining their own priorities and focusing on the regulation of AI in their respective jurisdictions, as opposed to some omnibus AI legislation at a national level. And what does that mean in practice? That means you have the FTC focusing on how AI could be used to amplify consumer fraud considerations, the SEC focusing on the appropriate disclosure of AI, not too much, but not too little on the risks and maybe not too much on the hype side of the equation. You have the various banking regulatory oversight organizations focusing on financial stability, on serving the consumer and ensuring transparency, and on down the line. The interesting thing to me about how this is developing is that you do have an organic dynamic where the regulators that are sort of most expert in their relevant jurisdictions can help define appropriate standards. And that's a good thing. That's helpful. At the same time, though, you do have the potential for a proliferation of a wide range of different standards from different organizations that need to be managed. And I think the best illustration of this is that different states are now introducing their own legislation. Colorado is the first to have an omnibus AI regulation, which covers automated decision making and a variety of sort of key requirements. California is advancing some legislation that is quite controversial in the tech and AI industry. and there's pending legislation in numerous other states. So one of the risks of the direction that we're heading right now in the regulatory framework is you could end up with a patchwork of inconsistent rules, which could make adoption and implementation of AI a lot more complicated. Europe has taken a very different approach, and they have led with an omnibus EU AI Act that is going to set a world standard, most likely. Whether it's followed in all the details, of course, it remains to be seen, but it's a much more comprehensive approach, maybe analogous to how the EU handled personal information in the context of the GDPR. So there's a lot to see, and all of this does sort of come back to an issue, which is that in managing governance and oversight in this area, it is really important to ensure that there's someone in the organization, it's probably going to be legal and compliance, who has the resources needed to track these developments and ensure that, number one, if you have a significant stake in the outcome of some of these regulations, that you have your appropriate voice that is participating in that process to make sure the regulations make sense for you and your industry. But ultimately, once adopted and effective, that you have the right compliance measures in place to ensure that you are acting in a manner that's consistent with the rules. And that will tie back, of course, to Caremark and other considerations a board would have from a board management perspective.
Yeah, I think you've identified a few issues that boards should definitely be mindful of, and ones on where I have views. They may not be down the middle of the fairway. And let me unpack that a little bit and again, get your reaction. Absolutely, there is a tremendous amount going on in the regulation of AI at the state, federal, EU, global level that companies need to monitor as part of their oversight function, but also, again, as part of their empowerment function, thinking, is our strategy consistent with the way regulation is evolving, or do we need to try and weigh in on the evolving nature of regulation? Absolutely, at the company level. Taking a step up to the level of authorities, whether it's states, federal governments, agencies across the continent in Europe. I think with AI, some of the classic mistakes that we've been making around regulation of truly ubiquitous developments are occurring. The first is to not look at the regulatory architecture as it exists. Let's take, for example, pharmaceuticals, which has an incredibly rigorous regulatory structure. My view is regulators, legislators should be looking at that architecture and saying, how do we incorporate AI considerations into that architecture rather than coming up with a whole new state or federal architecture that lays on top of that? Because what you're not doing is recognizing that the applications of AI are going to vary so much from industry to industry, and that you ought to leverage the fully developed, principles-based, you can monitor it for effectiveness regulation that you already have. And I don't know why this has become much more of a trend, but the idea that we need a new agency at the state level or at the federal level or at the EU level that sort of lays on top of or supplements other regulatory agencies in all cases is to me a huge mistake. It will slow down the productive integration of AI. Let me be clear that AI firms that are, like you said, gathering vast amounts of data, developing the algorithms, making the step change, they may need direct regulation around AI, but those are two very different things. And I do think that at the federal level, somebody should be stepping up and saying that that's how we should approach, or at least think about approaching regulation. The other risk of this sort of jump for new ubiquitous regulation or uniform regulation, where that's totally impractical, is it becomes a regulatory race to the bottom in a lot of ways. And that is not very effective. For example, the SEC labeled almost every electronic interface with a customer as AI related in its initial AI proposal, which effectively stalled a lot of enhanced engagement with clients for a little while. Luckily, that seems to have been abandoned. But we need an approach to the regulation of AI in most industries that is an overlay, a supplement, an augmentation to the regulatory framework that already exists, not trying to introduce a whole new framework.
And I agree with those comments. I would add that there is a significant trend in thought amongst those in the technology space around how AI should be regulated. That on the one hand, regulating the technology itself is a mistake, that instead the regulation should focus on how it's used. And so the regulation at the technology level can lead to overregulation, can lead to making AI developers responsible for things they cannot control downstream and the like. That's a real hot topic. If you imagine the world of potential harms that can come from AI, ranging from issues such as amplifying bias or creating significant mistakes in an area that has systemic importance to being used for deep fakes by bad actors for other nefarious purposes. There's sort of a lot there and a very significant debate around how to create a framework that will mitigate those harms and then also put liability sort of in the right place in the chain of distribution and development. So that's, I think, a real open topic in terms of how that's going to land. And the larger companies in the space of developing AI have been very forward leaning in saying that they believe additional regulations are necessary to help prevent the kinds of harms that could come from more advanced AI. And there's a global conversation really underway because even just addressing these issues at a national level will not be sufficient. And that plugs into an even bigger picture, which is that AI has become the frontier of really a geopolitical race to stay on the leading edge. And from a geopolitical perspective, there is a strong sense that the country that controls more advanced AI will have a significant edge, competitive edge, military edge, intelligence edge, cyber edge, really material edges. And so when thinking about regulation and the harms, there's the constant counterbalance of how to ensure that whatever is done from a regulatory perspective does not inhibit innovation or sort of prevent companies that are our champions, if you will, in this area from losing their leading edge position, which is important for not just our economy, but our position geopolitically and national security.
I could not agree more. Because of the benefits of scale in this area, I do not think that the large AI providers are going to be able to avoid direct regulation. I think in the sense of telecom networks were used in every industry, but there was no way that telecom providers were going to be able to avoid regulation. So I think that the AI providers would be wise to understand that that's an inevitability. But what level of regulation makes sense at that provider level? And what level of regulation should be left to the existing architecture that's in place at the industries that are implementing AI? So going to an industry we both know well, I would fully expect that the management of data sets, the collection, the distribution of information that is potentially personally sensitive and the like would be managed at the AI provider level in the first instance. But to the extent that that was used in the financial industry, and you were looking at things like investor protection, systemic risk, and prudential matters, that those would be implemented at the industry and industry regulator level. Trying to do the comprehensive approach at the financial industry level is probably completely ineffective. Trying to do the customer protection job at the AI provider level, also likely to be inefficient and ineffective. So I'm hoping that we recognize how this works within the existing architecture. And with that, Nader, I recognize that we're up against time, and what I'd really like to do is wrap up. Could you just summarize for folks what your advice is in the moment? And I'm going to ask you to do that in the context of, we really don't know where AI will be 5 years from now. We probably don't know where it will be 2 years from now. So we should all recognize that the advice today around governance, the advice today around regulatory structure and the like has to provide for a level of flexibility that recognizes we are dealing with uncertainty. And with that, can you just give us a few words to wrap this up?
Certainly, Jay. What I would say is that in AI governance, the key right now is to be proactive and informed. And the technology and the regulations are both rapidly evolving. So to stay up to date on market trends and be adaptable, it's really important for boards to understand how AI will affect their businesses, both the positive potential applications for reducing costs, increasing efficiency, and generating more revenue, reducing friction in various daily tasks or customer experiences, but also the competitive risks that could come from AI. There are industries where AI can directly impact the viability of a business model, and there's those where it may simply just provide some enhancements to efficiency. So understanding both the effect now and over time is really critical. That will require engagement with experts, potentially investing in training. And then with the establishment of a strategy and an understanding of the framework, making sure the governance is tuned appropriately to that intended use and having an ongoing communication oversight and loop to ensure that the deployment of AI works with the risk benefit framework that the board has established.
Well, Nader, as always, it's illuminating to spend time with you. Thank you for doing this. And I look forward to doing it again in maybe a year or two, and we see just how things have evolved.
Thank you, Jay. Likewise.
Thank you for listening to S&C Critical Insights. For more information about our practice, please visit us on the web at www.sulcrom.com. That's Sulcrom, SULLCROM.com.